Another day of saber rattling around the Korean peninsula. Pyongyang marking the 85th anniversary of the founding of the Korean People's Army with artillery drills, but stopping shy of a fresh ballistic missile test, as some had feared. The nuclear-powered USS Michigan making a port call at the South Korean port of Busan, while the Carl Vinson aircraft carrier strike group heads towards the East China Sea for later in the week a maritime drill with the South Korean Navy. Warnings and threats out of Washington and Pyongyang, well, they've become daily occurrences under Donald Trump, to the point where it's easy to wonder if maybe it's all just hot air. Is it, though? How volatile is the situation? What does Donald Trump want? Remember that as a candidate, he seemed ready to scale back U.S. presence in Korea. What do the Chinese want? And what do Koreans themselves want, be they north or south of the demilitarized zone? We'll be asking about the dynamic in Pyongyang and the mood in Seoul, where the current crisis has voters of two minds ahead of a May 9th snap presidential election. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if Kim Jong-un is becoming Donald Trump's best enemy. And with us to talk about it, Dorian Malovic. He's the Asia editor for French newspaper La Croix. Welcome back, sir. You're also the co-author of North Korea in 100 Questions, co-written with Juliette Morier. Joining us from New York, journalist Sang Won-yoon. Welcome back to the show. From Washington, Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thank you for joining us. And also joining us here in the studio, André Lozekrug-Pietri, the founder of investment firm A Capital. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The other big story out of all this, of course, is coming up Wednesday, the U.S. president to convene all 100 U.S. senators to the White House. They'll be talking Korea. Before we ask our panel about that, let's talk about what's happening this Tuesday. The U.S. Navy deploying, a military parade in Pyongyang, diplomats huddling in Tokyo. Yuka Royer has more.
The USS Michigan enters the South Korean port of Busan, carrying 150 Tomahawk missiles. The docking comes on the day North Korea marks the 85th anniversary of the People's Army. Officials in Seoul played down fears of escalating tensions.
The submarine is visiting Busan to reload military supplies and to allow its crew to take a break. There is no drill scheduled.
The nuclear-powered submarine is being joined by a fleet of warships headed by aircraft carrier Carl Vinson. This a day after North Korea warned of an all-out war over what it called Washington's madcap nuclear war provocations. In an unusual move, all 100 US senators have been asked to come to the White House on Wednesday to attend a security briefing. It comes after President Donald Trump hosted a lunch with ambassadors from the UN Security Council, urging them to step up action against Pyongyang.
The status quo in North Korea is also unacceptable, and the Council must be prepared to impose additional and stronger sanctions on North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile programs.
Meanwhile, in Pyongyang, residents paid their respects to the country's founder on the military anniversary. The West has been expecting provocations by North Korea on this occasion, but no nuclear or missile tests have been conducted so far.
All right, that's a snapshot of the situation, and it's only Tuesday. Dorian Malovic, first of all, let's talk about what we just saw. Before we talk about Wednesday, let's talk about what we saw in that report there. The artillery drills in the north, the deployment of that submarine, the airstrike, the aircraft carrier group.
Well, it's just, I mean, we can call that an escalation, but it's going on now for a week, even though the Ghost Armada was not here last week. But Trump just sparked the escalation for a week, but there was no danger. I mean, the Carl Vinson aircraft carrier was not here. Now
they announced that the arrival of the aircraft carrier, but it was at the time going in the opposite direction.
It was Singapore and Australia, very far away. So there was a overlap, and it was like kind of bluff or miscalculation. That kind of miscalculation can be very dangerous because it's heightened you know, the situation in the peninsula last week, you know,
so
for a few days.
if you say you're going to do something, do it.
Yeah, and now the trust. I mean, South Koreans are really, really touchy about Donald Trump's speech now, because they don't even mention that to the South Korean interim president, interim government, and there is no president. So it's a second player now, South Korea. It's terrible for South Koreans. I mean, our guest in South Korea can tell more about us. He's working with Japanese. Japanese Navy is also making a drill with the American now. I mean, the Carl Vinson is just another aircraft carrier in the region. They already maneuver for 2 months now. Now, we expected so-called nuclear test from North Korea, but they are not going to follow Trump's agenda. They have their own agenda. They are going to do it anyway, one day or another, when they choose the day, the time, the perfect timing, you know.
Why will they do it?
I mean, with Trump, they want, that would be the 6th nuclear test, but that would be a test to test Trump. Say, okay, you are showing the muscle, you are, okay, shouting, you say, okay, status quo, you know, is not possible, there is a new approach, is going to make it, you know, you want to see the cards, you know, it's a poker.
Sang Won-yoon, you agree?
Well, I think the fact that they didn't carry out a nuclear test and instead held an artillery drill goes to show that maybe North Korea is waiting to see a response from the Trump administration. I think it's not a coincidence that, you know, President Trump is bringing in these senators and held a luncheon with Security Council ambassadors and has called for, you know, essentially to get ready for a ramping up of sanctions against North Korea. And so in a way, for me, this situation on the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. response to it, as well as the Chinese response to it, is maybe at a point where we could potentially see a de-escalation of tensions, depending on what comes out of the meeting on Wednesday at the White House, as well as future coordination with Beijing. And one thing to add, though, as devastating as the news is, the fact that North Koreans have taken in another detainee at this timing goes to show that I think North Korea is trying to signal to Washington that it is looking for dialogue directly with the U.S. and not for Trump to use or essentially rely on China, essentially, you know, delegate this North Korea issue to Beijing. North Korea is signaling then, hey, we want to talk directly to you. And this has been sort of a classic approach by the Kim regime, in that they've never liked this sort of idea that, you know, being seen that China controls North Korea or that they're controlled by anyone. And I think it's been very strategic in the way that it tries to sort of play these different powers at hand and try to get opportunities for dialogue or some sort of, not necessarily dialogue for, you know, future resolution, but in a way to gain leverage directly with Washington and gain access to Washington.
All right, so arresting or taking hostage, or depending on how you look at it, foreign nationals, you're saying this is a sign that they want to talk?
In a way, I mean, I'm not saying that this is their way of saying, hey, we want to resume, you know, six-party talks, or we want to discuss sort of, you know, a long-term kind of decisive solution to the situation. But it's their way of saying, hey, we're willing to potentially discuss the possibility of another discussion, or at least something, that they're willing to talk. That's the way that I've seen it, in the way that they've had sort of the timing of detainees under all sorts of precarious sort of charges. This seems to me yet another example of that, as things are just continuing to escalate to a point where, you know, everybody, rightfully so, is worried about a full-on sort of collision, right? And so I think this is one way of interpreting this sort of recent detention.
All right, so Anthony Ruggiero, lots of reasons for everybody to worry, you just heard. Do you agree with Sang Won-yoon that there are perhaps silver linings in all this?
Well, I do not agree with the point that North Korea taking another American hostage is a signal that they want to talk to the Trump administration. North Korea last year in July 2016 closed what's known as the New York Channel, which was a channel for direct discussions between the United States and North Korea. If they want direct discussions with the United States, they can reopen that channel very easily. more likely is that that North Korea knows that in the past that they've been able to get high-level envoys, including former presidents, to come to Pyongyang to negotiate amnesty. And they also probably saw that President Obama paid Iran a $400 million ransom to get our American citizens home. So I think the North Koreans have a little bit more of a nefarious reason for taking that American.
All right, which brings us to the topic of what Donald Trump will be talking about on Wednesday with U.S. senators, convening them or summoning them, depending on how you look at it, to the White House. It's not unprecedented, but Anthony, it's very unusual. Why did he do that, do you think?
Well, I think it's unusual, but I think it's a way for the Trump administration using its secretaries, it seems, of defense and state to describe for the senators directly what they see as the situation on the ground, perhaps talking about what the Trump administration perceives as Chinese increasing pressure on North Korea. But I expect that many senators will have questions of what comes next. And of course, the sanctions law that passed last year passed 99-0. So this is really a bipartisan issue. And I think that a lot of senators on both sides of the aisles will be looking for, answers to those questions.
André Pietri, we're closing in on the 100 days since Donald Trump became president. Were you expecting this kind of escalation on the Korean Peninsula?
No, indeed, it's 100 days, and I must say it must be a pretty sweaty road for the Chinese leadership, because I think they expected it to be a rocky ride with Donald Trump. But the fact that on everything, on trade, on agreements, on Taiwan, and now on North Korea, Donald Trump would go this kind of war of movement. I think we were not used for a long time to have these bold moves. And as we all know, the Chinese are more, operating in the behind. And then on North Korea, I mean, China has a lot of stake. Because on one side, they don't want, and they already have now in South Korea, these anti-missile system, which is THAAD, which is obviously also affecting the whole region, including in Chinese mainland. Secondly, they don't want entirely U.S., they don't want reunification. They don't want a U.S.-dominated Korean peninsula. And on the other side, they're getting increasingly worried. I think they must be the most worried. I was in Beijing just yesterday about the fact that there is a potential war on their doorstep. So I think it must be pretty uneasy for the Chinese these days.
All right, explain this to us, because Chinese imports from North Korea, they fell 35% month on month in March. This after Beijing's February suspension of coal purchases. The Chinese, too, want to rein in Pyongyang. Exports, though, continue. And we had the announcement that Air China is to resume daily flights to North Korea. Some of those flights were officially suspended earlier this month because of low demand. Where do the Chinese stand when it comes to North Korea?
I think it's very complicated, obviously, to read like always. But I think again, the main they were probably the most biggest defenders of the famous status quo that Donald Trump was. That it was fine for them. It's keeping North Korea as kind of a we call that in French zone tampon, kind of a holding
buffer zone,
a buffer zone for Japan on one side, South Korea on the other. And now they see that the ramp up. They seem to be very, very pleased with the fact that Donald Trump initially gave indication that he was retreating from a trade point of view, even from a military point of view. And actually, it's exactly the opposite, which is happening. So this is worrying for the Chinese.
And when it comes to Korea, you heard Anthony Ruggiero's no fan of the Obama doctrine of strategic patience. What do the Chinese think when it comes to the Trump administration on that score?
Well, clearly, I mean, on one side, that's also a change which we are witnessing day by day. I mean, it has now been a second phone call. Yesterday, there was a very important phone call between President Xi and President Trump. The meeting in Mar-a-Lago 2 weeks ago was really seen as a big success. They established 4 working streams. By the way, one on cybersecurity, which is completely unexpected, coming especially from Donald Trump. So on one side, the relationship with the U.S. are getting actually probably on a closer note, and that's what. And on the other side, the Chinese see this ramping up, this rattling of saber, which is very worrying for them. So it must be a complicated situation.
Sang-Won Yoon, Andre telling us here that the Chinese have a difficult time reading Donald Trump. How about you? Do you understand where he's going when it comes to the Korean Peninsula?
I think that in a way that's similar to the approach that he has taken with many other issues beyond foreign policy. I think in the earlier weeks, he was maybe testing it out and just using the Syria example. Once the chemical weapons attack happened, he swiftly responded with an airstrike, right? And I think in a way, he was looking for a similar approach with North Korea. Hey, something rapid, show that the U.S. has force and that it is willing to use it, and just show that the U.S. is not going to be standing down or not meet its word on red lines, as the Obama administration has in the past come under a lot of criticism for. And yet he has learned that it's really not that simple, and we learn this. What he's learned about, the complexities of the Korean Peninsula in his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, right? Yeah. And so I think now it's gotten to a point where he's understanding that the military option, despite what has been said about all options being on the table, there really is not an option. That's not a choice at the moment. And I feel like now he's shifting to gear into sanctions, ramping up sanctions. And I think, again, this discussion with senators is going to potentially look at, ramping it up closer to what had been the case for the Iran sanctions regime. And I feel like secondary sanctions, which would be going after third-party entities that are found to have been facilitating illicit North Korean activities, to essentially, lose access to the U.S. Economy and the U.S. financial system, which is what made the Iranian sanctions regime so effective. And I think part of that would be, potentially a big discussion with senators on Wednesday, and maybe that could be the action that we would see from the Security Council. And I think that's potentially what President Trump discussed with Xi on the phone call recently as well.
All right, both Andre and Dorian want to react to what you're saying, but we have to take a quick break.